Hello! In this video, we're going to dive into the world of social insects and how their social behavior connects to their ecology and evolution. So to start that off, we should really define what sociality is. So there's actually a lot of different kinds of social behavior among that enormous diversity of insect species on the planet. But what we often mean when we talk about social insects are the eusocial insects. So you being true sociality. So these truly social insects, which are typically defined, or we often think of as these ants, termites, many species of wasps and bees, where only one or a handful of individuals reproduce. So many individuals forego their own reproduction, and then they sort of work together as a colony. So formally, we can think of three components of what makes eusocial insects truly eusocial. And one of those is cooperative brood care. So brood being the developing young, they work together to take care of developing young within the nest. They have reproductive castes, so only some individuals within the colony actually reproduce, when whether or not the others are either physiologically unable to reproduce or stopped from reproducing, just some individuals within the colony successfully reproduce. And also overlapping generations, so multiple generations living often in a nest or in the same colony together over time. But what's interesting is if we look across, again, this enormous diversity of insects, we actually see a lot of gradients in sociality, or some components of these behaviors sort of showing up. And so there's actually a lot of social behavior outside of the eusocial insects. So one example of this, if we think of sort of a hierarchy of these social behaviors or different levels of sociality, there are many communal species. So these are species that really lack any formal components of eusociality. They don't have cooperative brood care or reproductive castes or overlapping generations, but they do aggregate and work together in some sense. So the tent caterpillars are an example of this, where a bunch of eggs will be laid together, and when those caterpillars emerge, they will actually stick around and sort of keep a home base and get some thermoregulatory benefit, potentially among others, and so sort of hang out together but aren't formally social in the eusocial sense. And there's lots of species that exhibit communal behavior, some aspects of parental care. This is actually quite common across insects. But if we move up, there's also quasi-social insects. So this is an example from a sort of relative of many of the social bees, the allodapine bees. The picture here is Exoneura. But these are bees that the eggs will be laid, and the new bees emerge and actually stick around briefly and work together on raising or helping care for the developing brood. But they can all reproduce, and they don't overlap multiple generations. So there's some cooperative brood care, but these other components are missing. There's also many species that are semi-social, so sort of take another step up, where there might be cooperative brood care. They, for example, here in paper wasps, they work together to feed and take care of developing brood, and there are actually reproductive castes, so only certain individuals reproduce, but they don't have this overlapping generations component, so it's sort of, not fully technically eusocial. But if we think now just about the true eusociality, so this is sort of what we think of as having these three components of, again, overlapping generations, cooperative brood care, and reproductive castes. That has actually evolved many, many times, not just in the common examples, but there's actually some beetles, aphids, shrimp, and occasionally some vertebrates, including naked mole rats. So eusociality has actually evolved multiple times, but it is particularly concentrated within the Hymenoptera. So the Hymenoptera are ants, bees, wasps, and some of their relatives. And so that's it's actually evolved at least 8 times, probably more than that, independently within this group. So a lot of the concentration is within Hymenoptera. If we zoom in even just within bees here, we often think, again, of bees as highly social. So we think of honeybees and maybe bumblebees, but it turns out sociality is actually sort of the exception within bees. There's about 20,000 species of bees, which actually evolved from, they're really a kind of wasp, because they're a wasp that sort of re-evolved a vegetarian lifestyle from their predatory and parasitic ancestors. But among all the species of bees, the vast majority of those species are actually solitary insects, and only about 5% of species are social. And these are mostly concentrated in one particular clade, the corbiculate bees, shown here in gray, that are the honeybees, bumblebees, tropical cousins, the stingless bees, and also the orchid bees, which are a sort of semi-social outgroup. So within Hymenoptera, again, we have this huge concentration of what seem like multiple independent evolutionary origins of sociality. So a long-standing question has been why that is true in the Hymenoptera and not other social insects. Why do we have this concentration? And one of the hypotheses for that is because of the interesting and slightly strange sex determination system that Hymenoptera have. And it's called haplodiploidy. So unlike, say, vertebrates or many species that have a sex chromosome, that there's either X or Y copy of an S, and that chromosome can determine sex, what actually happens in Hymenoptera is males in the system only have one copy of all the genes. So they are haploid instead of diploid. So the haploid individuals can actually successfully grow and develop and become functional males or functional adults. And one consequence of this system where either having two copies becoming female or one copy becoming male is it actually changes relatedness within or between siblings. So one thing that can happen is actually females can lay unfertilized eggs, which only have one copy, which of course in us are non-viable, but those can become functional haploid males. But also when you have mating between a diploid female and a haploid male, what happens is all of the offspring get exactly the same copy of all of their chromosomes from the male parent, and then have sort of random 50-50 splitting of the chromosomes from the female mother. So a consequence of that is instead of getting overall 50-50, half of your genes are completely shared between siblings, between two sibling daughters, for example, and the other half that you get from mom is 50-50. So the aggregate effect is that actually between female siblings you have 75% relatedness instead of 50% relatedness, which is true for us, between us and our siblings. So much higher levels, this is the key takeaway, much higher levels of genetic relatedness between siblings within daughters and haplodiploid organisms. So one of the evolutionary consequences of that potentially comes out in this idea of inclusive fitness. So this being that not only can you gain fitness individually by passing on your own genes, but that you can also gain fitness by helping those same genes reproduce in other individuals that carry them. So for example, within families, if you help those same genes do well in your siblings, that's called kin selection, and that you can gain actually evolutionary benefit from helping those genes reproduce in related, physiologically distinct individuals. So one nice distillation of this idea was from the evolutionary biologist J.B.S. Haldane, you can ignore the extra C in there, who quipped that I would gladly give up my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. So the idea being that if your siblings have 50% of your genes, 2 of your siblings surviving should be just as good evolutionarily as 1 of you surviving. So the general idea is this higher level of relatedness within haplodiploid systems promotes inclusive fitness, and that might have been a way to get the evolution of this altruistic behavior. In either case, I should say that idea is really not the only idea of how this happened, and there's some limitations to it and some sort of counter theories. So this is actually still kind of an active area of debate and has been in recent years. But however it came about, we know that social insects evolved rapidly and really represent some of the most dominant, ecologically and evolutionarily dominant taxa on the planet. So here, see ants, bees, wasps, and termites, these really, really important species. And one of the reasons that might have happened, why these social insects sort of took off and did so well, could be that it actually promotes diversification. So this is an example from a recent study on termites, which I should note are not actually haplodiploid. So this whole argument about haplodiploidy and inclusive fitness doesn't actually apply to termites, so something else might be happening there. They evolved independently. They're more closely related to cockroaches. So an independent evolution of sociality separate from the Hymenoptera. But what we can do if we look here across the evolutionary tree or the phylogeny of termites, and then use some cool techniques to look at rates of speciation over evolutionary time, what this study found was that actually the evolution of sociality increased and promoted rapid diversification. So this may or may not be the case in all systems, and actually, like we said, the vast majority of species diversity in bees and likely in wasps too is actually is in the solitary taxa, not necessarily the social taxa, but at least in certain contexts, sociality can promote species diversification. And one of the really cool things that really helped fascinate many biologists with social insects is the amazing examples of collective behavior and communication within social insects. So here's one, and we'll just walk quickly through one particularly famous example, the waggle dance in honeybees. This is an example, a chapter that is in your, an example from one of the chapters for your reading, but looking through the waggle dance within honeybees. And if you haven't seen this before, it's this sort of amazing example of ornate communication in a social insect. And that's where individual honeybees will go out and find a food resource, bring it back to the colony, and then actually tell other workers within the colony about that food source through many different modes. So they waggle actively in a particular direction within a colony, turn around, and then continue waggling over and over. And with different parts of that dance, including how sort of actively they are shaking as they move through that, they communicate the quality of the resource. The length of the dance tells other workers how far that resource is, and the angle relative to the sun tells other workers what direction to go fly. So they translate that information they actually take the angle from the sun as workers would see it leaving the colony, and translate that to angles from vertical, and this sort of symbolic communication or translation from one mode to another. So basically the angle from vertical tells other workers where they should be flying. So they again encode quality, distance, and direction to other workers. And what's really interesting is there's multiple species of honeybees, and actually that symbolic component for the angle to the sun doesn't exist in open nesting relatives of honeybees. So they probably early in their earlier evolutionary past would just use the angle to the sun directly. But then once the cavity nesting evolved, for example, in what we think of as honeybees, of course you don't have access to the sun directly in that colony. So basically that communication evolved over time in sort of connection with the nesting ecology of these organisms. But just to say, a really amazing example of ornate communication within social insect colonies. Okay, and if we think now beyond just this sort of amazing biology, why else do we care about social insects? And one of those is that they are enormously important players in the global ecosystem and ecological dynamics. So one example of this is from a nice recent study that went and just tried to survey, sort of use existing data to estimate the biomass in soil of different kinds of invertebrates. And what they found is the vast majority of invertebrate biomass in the soil is insects, hexapoda. Yeah, so the most important group, almost half of that biomass, is termites, but also ants are really important. So basically the social insects play a really important ecological role and have huge biomass and impact. So part of that is social insects really important ecosystem engineers. So this is an example of termite mounds where these nest structures are partially designed for thermoregulation. You heard about that in one of the other videos, but also can change local climatic dynamics. So in addition to just their consumptive effects, termites can play an important role in microclimates and nutrient cycling. Another really cool example are these devil's gardens that occur actually in multiple places throughout the world, but these are examples from the neotropics, where this mutualism between an ant and its host tree, where the host tree provides physical nesting space and therefore sort of protection, and in return, the ants actually go and kill all of the other trees that are not of that host species around. So you get these interesting local patches where normally in a highly diverse tropical rainforest, instead what you see is just one species where everything has been killed. And that's actually because the ants themselves are selecting out species and really changing the local composition of these communities. And so because of their importance as ecosystem engineers, and also the incredibly important ecosystem services they deliver, like pollination, also decomposition. So these very important roles that social insects play, we care a lot about, and there's been a lot of focus, especially in recent years, trying to think about the many, many ways in which we are changing the planet, including through transformation of the chemical global landscape, physical transformation through development, agriculture, climate change, of course. How are these many, many aspects of global environmental change interacting to affect social insects? And that's a really interesting and important question, but also a bit of a challenging one, given the unique biology of social insects. So, for example, and this is something that we think about, that I think about in my own work and we think about in our lab, is thinking about how stressors affect social insects. And so if we want to, for example, connect, say, a stressor, in this case like an insecticide, and try to understand how that affects long-term dynamics of population health or community structure, we often think just about individual impacts. So things like, oh, what's the toxicity of an insecticide for an individual bee or termite or ant, right? But in social insects, there's this interesting other scale, right? So we need to not only think about how those stressors directly affect individuals, but how do those individual effects scale up to whole colony performance? And there's some interesting and complex feedbacks and mechanisms that make this different than just understanding effects on individuals. So one, for example, is colonies can actually alter exposure. So the colony behavior dynamics can alter how individuals are exposed to stress. One cool example of this is disease dynamics within colonies. I'll actually dive into this example on the next slide. Colony state can, given an exposure, actually modulate what the state of individuals are, and therefore their sensitivity. So one example of this is we know nutrition can often, nutritional state might modulate the effect of, say, another stressor like a pesticide. And colonies might be really good at having food reserves around, right? So maybe in a social colony where you have lots of extra food around, potentially the effects of a secondary stressor like pesticides or temperature might not be so extreme because you have this sort of colony state helping buffer you from that. There's also interesting decoupling between individual performance and the colony. So because of that, those reproductive castes, right, that only certain individuals reproduce, you can actually have individuals die and have a colony perform just fine. So there's, for example, division of labor, dynamic, other workers can sort of take up, if particular workers in a colony die, others can take up that slack. So basically, there's not such a direct link between individual performance and colony performance. And also, of course, the strange evolutionary dynamics of social insect colonies might affect the links between colony performance and population health. So just an example of this in a case where sociality might be detrimental is the effect of population size. So in termites that we just talked through a little bit, they might have millions of physiological individuals within a colony, right? But that colony might only have one reproductive queen. So even though the number of individuals is high, the evolutionary potential is actually somewhat low. Something we call the effective population size can actually be very low within social insect colonies. So maybe their evolutionary potential is actually reduced in response to these stressors. Just to dive into one of those examples, I told you about disease dynamics. This is from some really cool recent work showing that within social insect colonies, using some automated tracking systems and watching how individuals interact. Um, Whole insect colonies actually seem to dynamically respond in an adaptive way to the introduction of disease. And basically, when certain individuals get exposed to a disease, they get isolated within the social network. Something we're unfortunately very familiar with in the past few years in the COVID pandemic, this sort of restructuring of social networks. But this is something that ants actively do to minimize disease transmission within colonies. And this is thinking about basically not only how social dynamics might buffer responses or change in response to stress, but also understanding how stressors impact social dynamics is something that my lab is very interested in. In particular, understanding the effects of neonicotinoid pesticides that, for example, often show up as seed coating or sprays. Because they're systemic, these compounds end up showing up in nectar and pollen of floral resources that then get transported back to colonies and can affect things like social interactions or potentially social behaviors like thermoregulation. So this is an example from our own work where within a bumblebee colony, we can tag and track individual bumblebee workers and what they're doing, what behaviors they're performing, and also how they're interacting with each other. And something we find is we can sort of reconstruct the social networks within bumblebee colonies. And what we find is that basically here in red are sort of high realistic exposures to imidacloprid, one of these really common neuroactive insecticides. And we find that workers exposed to those compounds interact less with, or basically pushed to the periphery of the social network within these colonies. So real impacts of these compounds on how individuals interact with each other and also their ability to perform as a colony. So with that, I just want to finish up by sort of zooming back out and thinking about the importance of sociality. So sociality, this amazing example of an evolution of a behavior that has then dramatically impacted the ecological dynamics, the effect of these organisms, their role as ecosystem engineers across the planet, and also really critically important for preserving and protecting and understanding the ecosystem services that insects deliver under global change. So this is something we're going to continue to connect on our themes that we're going to return to throughout the semester.